A warm welcome to the 2022 Hagströmer Lecture. And this is the first one after the pandemic restrictions prevented us from arranging events like this at all. My name is Eva Orén. I'm the director of the Unit for Medical History and Heritage here at Karolinska Institutet, and also the director of the Hagströmer Library. And most of you will know what KI is, but for those of you who don't, that means Karolinska Institutet. We have arranged this lecture with the support of the Friends of the Hagströmer Lecture. So I really want to thank the friends. Are there any friends here? Some friends. Well, you're all friends as far as I'm concerned. And I also want to thank my colleague Anna Lantz, who has worked hard to make this arrangement possible. And the Hagströmer Library, what is that? Many of you have seen it already, but the Hagströmer Library is KI's historical library and book museum with a collection of around 150,000 books in medicine, health, and the life sciences. And it ranges from the 15th century to the late 20th century. It's particularly strong in the history of anatomy, pharmacology, botany, obstetrics, and dentistry, but many other subjects too. And we have the third largest collection of Linnaeus manuscripts in the world, and a superb collection of offprints of Nobel laureates in physiology or medicine. We are now located in the beautiful Haga Tingshus off campus, but we're hoping to move to a building right next to here on campus in a few years' time. And that way we will be much more accessible to all our friends and colleagues. And today's Hagströmer Lecture then. The Hagströmer Lecture is an annual lecture which brings internationally renowned scholars to KI with the purpose of putting current issues in medicine, health, or the life sciences in historic perspective, thus bringing together the humanities and the sciences. Previous Hagströmer Lectures have addressed eugenics and its relation to genetics, the informed patient, and planetary health. Today's theme then is, as you can see here, pandemic futures and pandemic pasts. It's a pandemic special with two speakers who will give short lectures, which will be followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A. And as I said before, the lectures will be filmed, so if anyone you know wants to see it afterwards, please tip them off. You can find it at the Hagströmer Library website in the not-so-distant future. After the lectures and the Q&A, there will be a reception out in the hallway, and you're all most welcome to join, even if you got to RSVP, because I think that many people have called in sick, so there will be ample refreshments afterwards. So the discussion will be moderated by one of KI's preeminent science communicators, Jessica Norrbom over here. Jessica is a scientist and a lecturer at KI's Department of Physiology and Pharmacology, specialized in molecular exercise physiology. She was awarded Enlightener of the Year 2021, not bad, for her work with debunking health myths through books and podcasts. And I'm going to introduce both speakers, and then we will move on to the lectures. Our first speaker is David Morens, who is a senior scientific advisor to Director Anthony Fauci at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at US National Institutes of Health, which he joined in 1998. Dr. Morens is trained in pediatrics, preventive medicine, infectious diseases, and virology. He has served as a public health service officer in various capacities at the Center for Disease Control. He was also professor of tropical medicine, microbiology, epidemiology, and public health at the University of Hawaii School of Medicine. Dr. Morens has authored hundreds of scientific articles in major biomedical journals, including co-authoring this one, you can see on the screen, where a group of scientists analyzed lung tissue preserved from victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which revealed genomic variability over time, and it's very interesting work that I can recommend. Dr. Morens' career interest for over 45 years has been the study of emerging infectious diseases, and he speaks and writes frequently on numerous aspects of emerging diseases, on viral disease pathogenesis, and on the history of medicine and public health. Please join me in welcoming David Morens. I'm just going to introduce Mark first as well, and then I'll give you the podium. Wait, more. Okay, that's fine. Our next speaker is going to be Mark Honigsbaum, who is a medical historian and journalist and academic with wide-ranging interests encompassing health, technology, science, and contemporary culture. A regular contributor to The Lancet and The Observer, he is the author of 5 books, including Living with Enza, The Forgotten Story of Britain and the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918, and that book came out in 2009. And The Pandemic Century, 100 Years of Panic, Hysteria, and Hubris, which came out in 2019. And it was named the Health Book of the Year by the Financial Times and Science Book of the Year in the Times. I can also recommend his Substack and pod, both titled Going Viral. A former Wellcome Research Fellow, Mark is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Journalism at City, University of London, where he teaches an MA specialism in health and science reporting and is researching the relationship between pandemics and cultural memory.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Professor Arndt, and the friends and all of you at the Karolinska. It's a great honor to be here to join with you tonight. The Karolinska is famous in America, and although I've had the privilege of traveling to Sweden before, I've never been here. It's very exciting for me, so thank you for inviting me. As Eva mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about pandemics, and then Mark Honigsbaum will give a talk which I'm greatly looking forward to. I want to say, let me get my notes here. I want to say, start off, that this is going to be hopefully a friendly talk which is not very scientific. As you heard, I'm a medical doctor and an epidemiologist, but I also appreciate the value of integrating medical history with science. And some of what I'm going to show you today makes that point. And I like to try to state this when I speak to audiences because the history of medicine is becoming forgotten all over the Western world. And medical schools in my country no longer have medical historians as they did when I started my medical career. So I think there's a lot of value to thinking about medical history when we think about cutting-edge science. And I want to convey some of that to you. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a tour of how I think about infectious diseases and emerging infectious diseases. And we start off by looking at a list. It may be small for some of you to see, but this is just a list of some of the important pandemics that have occurred either around the world or much of the world going back several thousand years. And we can see things like the Justinian plague in 541 AD. We can see the beginning of tuberculosis as a pandemic. We can see more modern things like Ebola and HIV/AIDS. And some of the other ones that you see, not on the list is COVID-19, but we will talk a little bit about that. Back in the Egyptian dynasties, in biblical times, we know that there were pandemic diseases. This is the mummy of Ramses V, whose body I was privileged to see about 40 some years ago when it was at the Royal Museum, and I was allowed to examine it. And it does have what look like smallpox lesions over the body. So there must have been pandemic smallpox over 3,000 years ago in Egypt. And at the same time, we know from other evidence that there was also epidemic polio. And there, in the biblical times, there were the biblical plagues. We don't know what any of those plagues were, but some of them are suspected of having been human emerging diseases. So the whole story of pandemics and emerging diseases is not a new phenomenon. It's existed since recorded historical time. And these emerging infectious diseases have been existential threats to human existence for a very long time. The Plague of Athens, Mark and I were just talking about this. The Plague of Athens occurred in ancient Greece in roughly 430 to 425 BC. The Greek general Thucydides wrote about it. It's a classical description, and even if you're not interested in Greek warfare, the Peloponnesian War, the description of the Plague of Athens, we don't know what the disease was, by the way, it's been argued about for centuries, but the description is, I would say, a classic in historical literature for a number of reasons that I won't get into, but it was the first recorded epidemic written down in real time, pandemic, I should say, written down in real time. It was the first epidemiologic description of a disease that we now are almost certain is infectious. Of course, we haven't identified it, but we know it was infectious. And it was said to be the end of the golden age of Greece. Pericles may have died of it, although his death occurred months after the epidemic was at its peak. But the writing of the Plague of Athens, if you didn't know better, you might think that somebody wrote it a few years ago. It's just phenomenally prescient in understanding the epidemiology and even the clinical medicine. Then we go forward to something everybody knows about, the Black Death of the 14th century, and it came to Europe in 1347, 1348, 1349 from what is now China and Mongolia. It took about 20 years to get to the eastern edge of Europe, and then spread all over spread all over Europe essentially, and of course it went other places too, but most of the records we have are European records. And the mortality was extraordinarily high. We don't know for sure, but estimates range from as low as 25% in areas where it was epidemic to as high as 50%. We know for sure that in some small areas, 50% of people died from bubonic or pneumonic plague, two different forms of this rodent-borne bacterial disease. And here is an interesting image, plague artwork. This is one of the first surviving pieces of art from the Stittney Codex sometime in the 14th century, probably not long after 1348, which describes, you can see some of the text if you have time to read it, but also has this gruesome image of death strangling a man who has a disease with lesions. And this is what people, this death was horrifying. And not only do we see it in the medical literature like this, contemporaries at the time, Boccaccio, Petrarca, and others, and Guillaume de Michaud, who was a poet and a singer, all wrote poetry and artistic writings about it. So this was something that affected everybody. It affected the culture, and it was one of the most important existential events to humans in recorded history. Now, we think about pandemics as being of three varieties. At least I think that they are. Three varieties, the variety being global, that means goes all over the world. Of course, when we go back several centuries, nobody knew the known world. I mean, people knew their own part of the world, but Europeans didn't know about the New World until 1492, and the people in the New World didn't know about Europe. So we have global pandemics now, but before that, we had pandemics that were interregional, that is, they spread over a wide geographic area, and we had ones that went between geographic areas, for example, from Europe to Africa, or in the case of the Plague of Athens, from Africa to Europe. But something interesting and important for us happened beginning in 1492, and that is, as those of us who know this saying in English, this is how school children learn discovery of the New World by people of the Old World. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he landed in the Caribbean islands, and later that year went back to Europe. He sailed from southern Spain, went back to Europe, and with him brought the disease of syphilis. Now, there is, like everything in medical history, there has to be a controversy about it. And there are some people who say that syphilis existed in Europe before 1493, but probably not, and the evidence, we can argue about if somebody wants to bring it up, but the prevailing thought, I believe, is that syphilis came back in 1492 with Columbus's men, and it was a deadly disease at that time, and a horrifying disease, much more serious than it is now. As we can see in some of these images, on the left is a very gory drawing from the late 1700s of the head of a deceased prostitute who died of tertiary syphilis with the missing nose, which is common way of dying from syphilis. And so the exploration of the world, which began in the age of the explorers in the 1400s, brought not only men and women to the New World, but brought diseases to the New World. But the Old World got even because let me see, I did the wrong, there we go. Because not so many years later, Europeans going back to the New World brought their diseases back, including smallpox and measles. And measles was then a deadly disease. Sometimes the mortality was as high as 30%. Smallpox usually 30% or more. And over the period of the first couple centuries, beginning in 1520, native peoples in the developed world were decimated by these old world diseases. This is an image of a disease which was called in the Mayan language Huizahuatl. And that's a tough one to pronounce in any language. Huizahuatl epidemics occurred for a few hundred years, a couple hundred years, into the 1600s, I believe. We don't know what it was, but we think most of it was smallpox and some of it was measles, and the mortality was extraordinarily high. And then, of course, in the 1700s, when explorers began exploring the Pacific Islands, the whole problem extended. And, of course, as North America got populated with Europeans in the 1700s and later, essentially what happened is native indigenous peoples around the world were wiped out by these European and other Western and Asian diseases. And in some areas, Ava mentioned that I used to live in Hawaii. It's estimated that over about 100 years' time, 10% of all 90% of all native Hawaiians disappeared either directly from disease or famine or social dislocation. So it looked at globally, these trading of diseases and movement of pandemic diseases are a major cause of devastation and death and population decrease over centuries' time. Countless millions of peoples, indigenous peoples in particular, were killed by this problem. Here we move forward to 1918. That's also been mentioned. Mark has written very well about that, a couple books, which I would encourage you to read. I'm not selling Mark's books, but they're great. This is an image of a woman ill and dying in bed with a little girl who is her sister, not her daughter, actually, crying beside her. And this is just a candid photo taken on the street of a truck exporting coffins. There were so many people dying. Many hospitals were human bodies, corpses were stacked like cordwood, wood for burning in a furnace or in a fireplace. They couldn't bury them fast enough, so there was a sudden industrial boom in cabinet makers making coffins. And this is a truck going down the street, which would have been a not uncommon sight in 1918. So many people died in 1918. That pandemic, which lasted less than a year, 1918, 1919, is estimated to have killed 50 or 100 million people. In today's population, that would be 2 billion people. So this is the deadliest event in recorded human history, more than any war, more than any other single event. And you know, we don't know enough about it to say that this wouldn't happen again if a virus like this came back. And in fact, SARS-CoV-2 was pretty deadly. In my country, 1 million people or more have died already from it. So these pandemic diseases are not just phenomena that doctors and historians write about, they're existential threats to all of us. This is Ebola. I was involved in the first Ebola epidemic in 1976, and then I went back to the West African epidemic, first to the country of Liberia, and then to the country of Guinea. And this is sort of a pandemic, by, you know, depending on how you define it. It has gone all the way across Africa, so that's an interregional pandemic. And now, when it started in 1976, the first pandemic that we saw, it was regional. It didn't come back for a few years, but now it's going on somewhere in Africa almost continually. And our responses to these pandemics have not changed so much over the centuries. And you can see this is a 17th century mask worn by doctors treating the plague, which was you know, bubonic pneumonic plague. And oftentimes in the end of those long beaks would be, there are different things in them, but there would be sometimes flowers and herbs and disinfectants. The idea believing before the germ theory, nobody knows what caused these diseases, but they were contagious. So it may have been something in the air, people thought, not plague, but whatever. And the idea was that you breathe through these things and you are breathing something that will disinfect, even though there was no concept of infection. And even in the 1600s, beginning in the 1600s, there was a literature and a social awareness of what was called Loremology, or what we would say in English is Loremology, the study of, and Loremology more or less describes, more or less corresponds to study of emerging infectious diseases. And here we can see a couple books, the one on the left published in 1613, and the one on the right published in, I have to read it, 1626, I guess. And one has the beginning title Loremology, and the other Loremolographia. I have trouble with these tough Greek and other words, but anyways. And so you can see that people wrote about this stuff, and these were medical books, but also popular books. There's quite a few of them, and the term Loremology is still used occasionally today. It's really emerging infectious disease. And I just want to make a sort of a comment on the far right panel here. In English, it says this is from a different book by a man named Thompson. You're not seeing the frontispiece of this, but it says 4 things chiefly are necessary to contagion. And those 4 things he lists there, and when we read them, we say, well, it doesn't make any sense. This was before the germ theory. But if you reconceptualize that, this is what he was really saying. To have a pandemic or an epidemic disease, you need a mechanism of the agent's transmission, an environment for transmission and acquisition to spread it and to get it, host susceptibility. They didn't know about immunity then, but they knew that people who got it had to be susceptible to it, and some people seem not to be susceptible, and a specific reservoir of the disease agent, which might be, a reservoir might be, we now know, water in the case of cholera, or you know, rats in your house, and fleas, rat fleas in the case of plague. And you know, the idea that there's a lot of diseases out there killing us it goes throughout literature if you really look for it. This is a quotation from Sidney Smith to Lady Grey, rueing the fact that I hope you're well today because there's 1,500 diseases at least out there to which man is subjected and might kill us. Now, I want to say a little bit about what these pandemics are, just to categorize them, and I don't want to go over time. I think I'm okay. This is a pretty busy slide, but I'll show you a more easy to read one. This is just an image put together by the people at the medical journal Cell, What these medical journals do is they force you to spend a lot of money to make your own pictures, and then they immediately have their artists change them so they can copyright the changed version and make a lot of money off it, and you get none of that. So that's what happens. But you know, we made an image which was much less busy, and they busied it up and copyrighted it. And what the point of this is that there are now, we think of 3 flavors of emerging infectious diseases. Newly emerging, those things that were never around before but appeared suddenly, like SARS-CoV-2, like SARS in 2002 when it first appeared. And then there are re-emerging diseases. Those are diseases where the agent has been around, but it hasn't been a problem for a while, and all of a sudden it becomes a problem. Perhaps it becomes a problem because it moves to a new area. So for example, in 1999, an East African / Middle Eastern virus called West Nile virus, which had never been in, as far as we know, in the Americas and had never been in Russia, suddenly appeared simultaneously, was exported by airplane simultaneously to both America and Russia, and now we have West Nile virus all over the Western Hemisphere and in Russia as well. And where did I might have gotten one of my slides out. Let me just, the slide I wanted to show you, I must have put that further down. So, but let me just say that part of the reason we have these emerging diseases is that the bugs mutate very quickly. It's like Darwinian evolution. Why does a giraffe have a long neck? Because the savannas in East Africa have all the food way at the top of the tree, and a small horse or a small cow couldn't reach up and get the food, but over time, your species grows its neck to be higher and higher so you can get the food, and the giraffes who get the food become bigger giraffes and so on. But that's the way the bugs work, and the human genome, our closest ancestor, humans, is the chimpanzee, and we branched off. Our common ancestor, chimpanzees and humans, occurred about 8 million years ago, and the genomes of humans and chimpanzees are about 99% alike or about 1% different. So that means that it took human beings 8 million years to evolve our genome 1%. A virus can evolve its genome 2%, twice as much in one day. So in other words, they can evolve around us. You know, we can't, as a human species, we can't evolve quickly. We don't want to evolve quickly, but the virus can do that. They're always adapting to us. And where do these pandemics come from? Well, it turns out about 75% of them come from animal viruses and bacteria and so on, and you can see some examples here. HIV came from various different primates. There was not one HIV pandemic. There were at least 3, if not more, but by the time we recognized them, we thought it was one disease, but in turn, these emergences happened. HIV was first recognized in 1981, but the virus got into human beings 3 different times as far back as the 1880s. So it was around for a long time. It just took a while to percolate and get up. Now, now is time for me to shut up for 2 seconds and ask an audience question. You don't have to answer this, but this is just a thought experiment. What is the deadliest animal man has ever known? Just think about it. And here's the answer. The mosquito. This is a mosquito pupa. The mosquito in this picture is Aedes aegypti, the deadliest human mosquito, other than Anopheles gambiae, which causes malaria, but this one causes yellow fever, dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. And a disease that is a reservoir in insects, ticks or mosquitoes, is particularly complicated because the ecology of the existence of the virus is complicated. It's not like measles, where you can make one vaccine and you can hope to eradicate the disease, or polio, which we hope to eradicate soon, or smallpox, which we eradicated. When the ecology of the existence of the bug is complex, it makes the problem worse. And here are the world's deadliest animals. You can see that number 1 is the mosquito. Number 2 is human beings. We have wars, we murder each other, we commit suicide, and, but that's nowhere near as bad as what mosquitoes do to us. And then all the other ones people worry about, like in my country, sharks. You know, we have a lot of coastline, and we have sharks, and about as many as 10 people are killed every year around the world by sharks. But that's not something to worry about. And then, of course, we have the cause of SARS-CoV-2, of COVID-19, which is a bat virus, right out of bats. This is a bat out of hell, and the virus is came out of a bat from hell. This is the bat that the virus came from, called Rhinolophus, is a genus of bat, and it's the source of SARS-CoV-2. It's an ugly little guy, but you know, there are many different viruses like SARS, the original SARS, the 2002, 2003 version, and SARS-CoV-2, and they're almost certain to come out. This is not the end of SARS. We're going to have more of these because they're in bats all over an enormous geographic area in Southeast Asia, overlapping into southern China, and human beings have the receptor for all of these viruses. So we're going to be seeing at some point, hopefully not soon, SARS-3 and SARS-4, and it's going to be a long time till we find a way to solve that problem. Well, this is a busy slide. This is the one I wanted to show you and move on from it, showing that the emergence of these pandemics is not such a simple thing as a bad bug got us. It's the fact that the diseases and emergences are caused by combinations of properties of the agent, the virus or the bacterium, the host, which is us, and the environment. And the environment is a big, complicated thing, and what is happening is the environment has been degraded by man. The whole world now is man-manipulated and degraded by human beings. It's degraded in terms of deforestation, reconfiguring water flow, allowing environmental degradation that creates mosquito and vector encroachment and so on. And in fact, to make it simpler, I think you can read this. This is about the top 12 determinants of disease emergence, and you can read them. I won't spell them all out, but probably the most important two are human movement, including crowding, that is, traveling around and crowding. In the Middle Ages, the average person lived and died within 10 miles of each other in Europe, and now most of us have been on airplanes, have been all the way around the world, and most places in the world you can reach by airplane in less than 2 days. Most places in the world. So, in other words, 8 billion people in the world, and we can all be everywhere, and we are. And we bring our diseases with us. So this really magnifies and upregulates the possibilities of emergence and the damage that's caused by emergence. Now, this is a funny photo of something that I hope none of you have ever heard of. And I had never heard of it until recently, but this is the annual Sturgis, South Dakota Motorcycle Rally, which occurs every year, when all these motorcycle dudes with tattoos on their arm come from all over America and even from Europe and Asia to come to this little tiny South Dakota town to have a rally on their motorcycles. And this is the year 2020, in which the town of Sturgis, like most other towns, had regulations against COVID, such as masking and social distancing. Well, if you look at this photograph closely with a magnifying glass like I have, there are over 1,000 people in this photograph. I have not found one that was wearing a mask. And after this went on for 10 days, this rally, and a German group studying it has decided, I don't know if it's true, but this is what they said, that all of the cases that occurred in the United States in the next month after this, 19%, almost 1/5, were directly or indirectly traced to this event. So you can see how this is an example of how crowding and human movement can amplify to an extraordinary degree the possibility that a virus will spread and infect a whole bunch of different people. So just to make that point, the world's most dangerous vectors in flight are the mosquito and the airplane. What you're looking at, this is sort of an older image. This is a real-time image from about 15 years ago of flights that are occurring in real time around the world. And each yellow dot is an airplane. And I think this slide lasts for about 10 seconds, but this is what's happening. Of course, it's been sped up, but this is what's happening. You can see an extraordinary degree of flight, and you can see where it's concentrated. North America, Europe, and to a lesser extent, Southeast Asia. This is why we have pandemics and why they spread so quickly. Now, I'm not going to answer these questions, but these are just some things I think you might want to think about when we get to our discussion section. And I'll just read these out. Why are some infectious disease pandemic and others not? Are there properties of diseases that are susceptible to becoming pandemic, but others not? Are there microbial, host, or environmental variables that support pandemicity, that a variable that will allow a particular bug to go pandemic? And can these characteristics be identified so that we can do something about them? And then finally, have we entered a new era, a new pandemic era? We've had in recent years SARS-CoV-2, going back 20 years, we've had SARS-CoV-2, we've had Zika, we've had chikungunya, we've had Ebola, which is regionally all across Africa pandemic. We've had SARS-1, and in 2009 we had an influenza pandemic. We get those all the time. Is this a new thing? I mean, it's been going on for years, but is it going on at an increasing pace? And then finally, I'm going to close by showing you a couple slides that are pretty busy, but I'll try to explain what they are, if I can get the pointer to work. So you're seeing data which is human DNA excavated from people who died before, during, and after the 1348 pandemic. This is a paper in Nature. Let's just look at the red for a minute. Let's not, the red is London, and the blue is Denmark plague sites. And what we have here in each of these panels is before the Black Death is here a prevalence of various genes. We don't need to know what these genes are, but these are human genes. Before the Black Death, during the Black Death, and you know we can identify that because there are plague pits in which bodies can be excavated. The DNA can be taken out of the inside of the teeth. And then after the Black Death, and then in the modern era. And what you can see is we have 4 different genes here, and what you can see is this gene is now much more common in human beings than it was before the Black Death. This gene, much more common than before the Black Death. Same with this gene, but this gene over here is less common. So what happened is one medical event of a pandemic changed the human gene pool, and it's been changed for over 600, almost 700 years. More crazy than that, is that this gene is associated with Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease. And this gene is associated with both rheumatoid arthritis and systemic lupus erythematosus. These are what we call autoimmune diseases, inflammatory diseases. So what these data seem to be telling us is that when the bubonic plague came along, it killed a lot of people, but some were spared, and those who were spared had genes that accidentally protected you, you know, good to have them, but they weren't there because they were going to protect you. They were there for some other reason. And those genes were selected against because everybody who didn't have them died. Many people who had them lived. And those people who lived had offspring, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who are alive today, and they still have those genes. Whereas other genes went away. And so, you know, in other words, the profile of diseases that human beings get are affected by long ago pandemics, and we now have in the human population people who get autoimmune diseases completely unrelated to bubonic plague, but we have them because they haven't been weeded out through breeding of people who do and do not have the genes, because a lot of people have the genes, and it may take centuries to have those genes, you know, weeded out of the pool. So basically the whole human gene pool and many of the diseases we get, including chronic diseases, have been shaped by one pandemic at one point in time. And the very last thing I want to say is this. Ghosts of pandemics past. Almost every disease, infectious disease we have now that is global, that is to say, the bug is found everywhere all over the world, and the disease is found everywhere all over the world, had by definition to have been pandemic. It came from somewhere. If it's all around the world, at some point it became pandemic. And we think tuberculosis became pandemic maybe 7,000 to 1,000 years ago. But all these other things, rotavirus, diarrhea, these are all things that the same bug is found all over the world. So these viruses became pandemic. And what that means is all the infectious diseases we have to deal with, colds, diarrhea, whatever, at one time were pandemic, and now they've just become endemic. They're in the background, and we treat them as if they're sort of nothing. but they're the end results, the embers still burning of pandemics of the past. So I'm going to end here and turn the podium over to Mark, because I'm really eager to hear what he has to say. And I want to thank you for listening to me, and I hope we get a chance to have a discussion afterwards. Thank you.
So thank you very much, David, for that marvelous talk and for reviewing the history of pandemics. You've set up my talk very nicely, I must say. I just want to begin by saying a big thanks to Eva Ahren and the Hagströmer Library for this wonderful invitation. I don't know if you had the same experience as me, but you know, COVID was a terrible event, particularly because I had to do all my lecturing online and all the teaching online. And at the end of like 1.5 years of that, I said, I'm never going to do another online lecture. I think I've probably broken that, but it's very nice to be in a room with real people, even though there's a risk of us all crowding together. Okay. So the title of my talk is Remembering Pandemics, Imagining COVID-19. So nearly 2 years ago, on the eve of his inauguration as the 46th President of the United States, Joe Biden held a candlelit vigil at the Lincoln Memorial. I have a picture of it here. It was a vigil for victims of the coronavirus pandemic. So by January of 2021, some 400,000 Americans had died of COVID-19. And after one of the most rancorous presidential elections in history, Biden wanted to signal a change of political tone. Standing in front of the reflecting pool on the Mall in Washington, D.C., surrounded by, you can see, 400 lights. They were candles lit all around the reflecting pool, representing the casualties, the American casualties of COVID. Biden used this moment to urge Americans to put their differences to one side. And this is what he said, I'm quoting directly. "To heal, we must remember. Between sundown and dusk, let us shine the lights in darkness along the sacred pool of reflection and remember all whom we lost." Since then, of course, there have been further moments of silence, most notably on the 12th of May of this year, when the United States passed the milestone of 1 million COVID deaths, which prompted the Stars and Stripes to be flown at half-mast on federal buildings. But at time of writing, there is no permanent US memorial to COVID-19. Nor, despite numerous proposals by artists, architects, and bereaved groups, has any other country seen fit to commission a national memorial to the pandemic. Though Britain, my country, recently launched a consultation exercise asking the public how they wish to commemorate the pandemic. To my mind, it's as if, rather than looking into this reflecting pool and remembering, we have collectively drunken the waters of Lethe, and we're already in the process of forgetting our experience. Why this should be so is puzzling, given the global sweep of COVID-19 and the way that the coronavirus has disrupted social life and traditional mourning practices. According to a recent study by the National Academy of Sciences, for every COVID death, approximately 9 Americans will have lost a grandparent, parent, sibling, spouse, or a child. If you use the current estimate of 1.1 million US deaths, that's equivalent to 10 million grieving Americans. Here in Sweden, where the death toll stands at 20,000, that's about 180,000 people mourning the death of a friend or a loved one. Why does this matter? Well, one of the functions of memorials is to provide a canvas for the imagination so that the individual and collective nature of losses from wars or pandemics can be preserved in public memory. Without such mediation, collective memory struggles to find a purchase, hampering the ability to incorporate so-called lessons for the prevention of future pandemic crises into our present experience. But here's the odd thing. While wars are endlessly memorialized in Western culture, it's relatively rare to come across a memorial to victims of a pandemic, much less a monument recalling the heroism of health workers who have perished on the front lines of humanity's recurrent battles with pathogens. For example, despite killing more than 50 million people worldwide, There are no contemporary memorials to the 1918-1919 Spanish influenza pandemic in either Europe or North America. Memorials to the 14th century Black Death and the outbreaks of plague and cholera that swept Europe in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries are similarly sparse. So in this talk, I want to focus on the role of memory, and medical memory in particular, in our remembering, imagining systems. Memory is a valuable cultural resource, one that can help us prepare for the next pandemic. But it can also, and this is the problem with memory, it can also distort our responses, blinding us to the pandemic that may be just around the corner. For example, in 2002, few infectious disease experts were expecting the SARS epidemic. Although coronaviruses were responsible for a third of common colds, they rarely cause fatal outcomes in humans. And I think it's fair to say, and David maybe support me with this, they were a somewhat neglected area of medical research. Instead, the big grants went to influenza virulence research and surveillance of H5N1 and other avian flu viruses. Similarly, in 2014, few scientists thought that Ebola, a pathogen previously confined to equatorial regions of Central Africa, could cause a regional epidemic in West Africa, much less reach a major city such as Nairobi or Dallas. In each case, what was known before the emergence event was shown to be false, sparking much soul-searching about what scientists and public health experts should do to avoid such epistemological blind spots in the future. This is one reason why, for me, when I heard politicians talking earlier on the pandemic about we're following the science, it was a sort of nonsense. Because as you know, scientists frequently disagree, and it can take time to reach a scientific consensus. This is particularly the case, I think, at the beginning of a pandemic, when the identity of a pathogen, its mode of transmission, and its infection fatality rate may be unclear. At such times, we return to what the historian of science, Lorraine Daston, calls, and I'm quoting, a state of ground zero empiricism, reminiscent of the scientific debates of the early 17th century, when, as she puts it, everything was up for grabs. But I'm digressing a little bit. So the theme I'm returning to now is really why governments in the global north were so unprepared for the emergence of SARS-CoV-2. And I think the reason is partly to do with the fact that we'd forgotten the experience of SARS-1 in 2002, but we'd also failed to sufficiently cultivate the memories of other epidemics and pandemics in history. So an example, an obvious example here is, this is, as David spoke a little bit about the 1918 influenza. Historiographically, in medical history, it was for a long time known as the forgotten pandemic, because really after World War I, there were no books about it. It didn't enter into any encyclopedias of the 20th century. All the books were about the First World War. It was forgotten even though it killed approximately 50 million people globally, which is something like 5 times as many who perished in the First World War, which of course is the better remembered event with which it coincided. Now, I think one result of this was that when, just over 100 years later, China announced it was quarantining Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, and then extended those measures to other cities in Hubei province, placing an astonishing 35 million people under lockdown, most people thought that China was overreacting. Certainly, few thought that a pandemic was imminent. I say few, but there were exceptions. And they were, for the most part, they were found within medical circles. For instance, in January 2020, Andrew Pollard, who was the director of the research group at Oxford responsible for the AstraZeneca vaccine, was attending a conference in France. This is in January 2020, very early on, middle of January. And there he fell into conversation with an epidemiologist called John Edmonds from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So Edmonds had been tracking early case reports from China, and he was growing increasingly alarmed. According to Pollard, Edmonds told him that the coronavirus outbreak was, quote, going to be like 1918, a terrible scourge on humanity. So this is Jeremy Farrar, Director of Wellcome Trust. He's a keen student of history, and he'd long been concerned by the threat posed by H5N1 avian bird flu. And he had noted that the source of the 1918 pandemic had most likely been an avian influenza virus that had leapt the species barrier. Farrar had also been present in Vietnam during the SARS epidemic in 2002-2003, where the virus had claimed the life of his good friend, the Italian parasitologist Carlo Urbani. So fearing that unlike SARS, SARS-CoV-2 might be capable of asymptomatic spread and was already transmitting undetected under the radar, Farrar says he was baffled by the WHO's decision to delay the announcement of a public health emergency of an international concern until January the 30th of 2020. And he wrote an email, an internal email to his colleagues of the Wellcome, and this is a direct quote. He said, "This cannot be contained in China and will become a global pandemic over the next few weeks. This is the first time since SARS that I have been worried." And you can read the rest of his account in his book, Spike, the Virus versus the People, now a bestseller on the Sunday Times bestseller list in the UK. Okay, so Ava's kindly mentioned some of the books I've written. On the right, this is the American edition. It was Norton who commissioned the Pandemic Century originally. So I don't claim to have foreseen the coronavirus pandemic. I want to make clear, it was just fortuitous my book came out shortly before. But as a medical historian who had written several books on pandemics, I also could not help but be struck by the parallels with SARS and with the Spanish flu. Now, my alarm heightened when I saw the videos of Chinese construction workers preparing the ground for new hospitals in Wuhan, followed by pictures, here we go, followed by pictures of the emergency waiting rooms with rows and rows of empty cubicles. So for me, those images immediately recalled an iconic photograph taken in the spring of 1918 at Camp Funston, a large US Army training camp in Kansas, where American troops were being prepared for military action in northern France. And this is the picture I'm talking about. As you can see, it shows hundreds of soldiers laid out in cots in what was called an emergency influenza ward. We know from the contemporaneous medical accounts that most of them suffered a brief 3-day fever, but about a fifth of the 1,200 men were hospitalized with aggressive pneumonias, and 75 of those men died. Now, the reports of that outbreak have led some historians to conclude that it was a herald wave of the Spanish flu. Other researchers, I should say, disagree, noting that similar outbreaks, accompanied by high mortality in young adults, were seen in Copenhagen a few months later. Nonetheless, I found myself returning to this image during the initial weeks of the coronavirus pandemic. And as my Twitter feed filled with images of desperate patients besieging emergency rooms in Wuhan, I could not help but wonder whether history was repeating itself. It didn't, of course, or not exactly. Though to date some 6 million people have died of COVID-19 globally, 80 million if you use the measure of excess deaths, that figure hardly compares, as David said, with the mortality from the Spanish flu when you adjust for the subsequent growth in world population. And although SARS-CoV-2 is roughly twice as infectious as the H1N1 virus that caused the Spanish flu, it has not turned out to be the big one, which has long been predicted by Bill Gates and others. If we are to believe the prophets of pandemic doom, that event lies in the future, in a period that some are already referring to as the pandemicene. Though whether it will be our future or our children's, no one at present can say. However, I think it is fair to say that the measures taken to contain COVID-19 have been exceptional. Never has social distancing been applied at such a scale. and never have so many people globally been locked down all at the same time, perhaps with the exception of Sweden. So to take just one example, the third British national lockdown lasted 194 days. That's more than 3 times the length of the quarantines imposed during the plague of Florence in 1630. So because the pandemic has coincided with a period of rapid global communications, as David has explained, and also economic and political turmoil, it's tempting to see our experience as unique. So this is an example. This was a claim made, as you see, quite early on in the pandemic. Thomas Frieden published this column in March 2020, and he made this provocative claim that COVID was going to be our new historical divide. And henceforth, this time would be remembered, there would be a time BC, before Corona, and a time called AC, after Corona. However, following the war in Ukraine, that periodization looks somewhat questionable. As in 1918, when a war in Europe also overshadowed a pandemic, COVID-19 may turn out to be a footnote in a much bigger and more far-reaching global crisis. Such statements remind us of the pitfalls of premature judgments and the dangers of privileging presentist narratives. Rather than looking to the past in search of so-called lessons, we need to be alert to discontinuities with the present. And we also need to be wary of drawing shallow analogies that ignore the specific social, cultural, and political contexts that shape the reception and the impacts of pandemics in different historical periods. Indeed, for historians of medicine, disease is not only a biological entity, but a social framing device, a prism, if you like, through which we can view the fault lines in society and the structural weaknesses in our health and welfare systems. So as the social historian of medicine, Charles Rosenberg, put it in his book, The Cholera Years, which was a major influence on me when I was studying for a PhD, he wrote, "Epidemics are ingeniously designed natural experiments, which allow historians to examine fundamental aspects of society in a controlled and abundantly documented context." Well, it may not have been all that controlled, but boy, have we documented COVID-19, which itself actually will present a huge challenge to future historians when they try and write something like a definitive history of this pandemic. The point is that rather than seeing disease in terms of contamination and as something that ought to be eradicated, Rosenberg encouraged historians to study the complex ecological configurations and the interrelationships between pathogens and human and non-human bodies. His purpose, his aim, if you like, was to break down facile yet durable typologies of purity and danger. So my principal role today is to remind you of how people at different times and in different places have responded to outbreaks of infectious disease and how they have presented similar challenges to society today. In the process, I suggest we need to be alert to the ways in which the mathematical and the life sciences shape our understandings of pandemics and their pathogens. These sciences and the knowledges which they lay claim to are not givens. They also have a history, one that medical historians and historians of science, sociologists of science historians, are well placed to deconstruct. So let's have very rapidly a little bit of a deconstruction here. I think a good place to begin would be with some of the key terms employed during the pandemic, which were naively amplified by journalists and medical commentators, often unaware of their complex and contested histories. So a good example from my country, but also these same narratives were worldwide in America, and I think to a degree in Sweden, although I don't think anyone here actually the government used the term herd immunity, but you seem to pursue a policy pretty much along those lines. So at the beginning of the pandemic, many scientific experts predicted that COVID would end once we achieved a threshold known as herd immunity. So this, as I'm sure you know, is the notion that when a sufficient number of people have been infected with COVID, they would be immune to reinfection and could not continue to transmit the virus to susceptible individuals. Interestingly, though, this threshold was never defined. However, based on epidemiological modeling of the reproductive rate of the virus, it was thought it would kick in when something around 70% of the population had been infected and had recovered. This is before, of course, we knew we were going to have vaccines, right? Since no COVID vaccines were available at the start of the pandemic, this led experts in the UK and elsewhere to advocate a policy of permitting the coronavirus to spread unimpeded through the population. So as the UK's Chief Scientific Officer, Patrick Vallance, you can see at the right, put it, the goal was, and I'm quoting, to build up some kind of herd immunity whilst protecting the most vulnerable. The alternative, we were led to believe, would be a series of stop-start lockdowns that would temporarily reduce the peak of the epidemic, but leave the majority of the population susceptible to infection once those restrictions were lifted. Now, it depresses me to say that in the UK, in our right-wing tabloid press, the poster child for this policy was Sweden. Even though Stockholm is less densely populated than Oslo and 2/3 the size of London. Nonetheless, such was the sway of this herd immunity concept that when the first COVID vaccines became available, it dominated the exit strategies of countries in the global north. What scientific experts failed to mention is that herd immunity is a concept borrowed from veterinary medicine and which was taken up by British epidemiologists in the aftermath of the Spanish flu. So through experiments on caged mice, Major Greenwood, who was a professor of epidemiology at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and his colleagues at the UK's Medical Research Council, attempted to understand how the shifting ratio of susceptible and immune individuals fueled or could restrain epidemics. Their central hypothesis was that epidemic waves fall because the average resistance of the herd is raised. And Greenwood continued, another wave will follow it at a later date, when waning immunity causes the average herd immunity to fall below some critical level, which could shift and change, right? So in other words, herd immunity, as originally conceived, was not so much an elimination threshold as a mechanism for epidemic abatement. The term was actually coined by the experimental epidemiologists Topley and Wilson in 1923. And by the 1930s, it was a staple concept for epidemiologists who were interested in disease ecology, because it's helped them to articulate the population dynamics of diseases such as diphtheria and also, of course, influenza. It was following really the Second World War and the production of sterilizing vaccines against polio and later measles that it came to signal this mystical point, if you like, at which mass vaccination would halt the onward transmission of disease. But of course, now that it's evident that, as with influenza, vaccination against COVID does not produce sterilizing immunity against mutant strains of the virus, we can see that stripped of its history, the concept of herd immunity was misleading and unhelpful. Misleading because the Elysian fields of herd immunity were, and perhaps never will be, reached. It's unhelpful because it led some to countenance a policy of letting the virus rip or advocate unworkable policies such as the Great Barrington Declaration. I just really want to very quickly talk about another, the language we've all been employing and banning about, this idea that there's a hard and fast distinctions between pandemic, epidemic, and endemic. So these distinctions really kind of begin to break down quite quickly when you dig into and you look into their history. So the notion of endemicity can be traced to the attempts actually by colonial era epidemiologists to characterize diseases such as cholera, malaria, and plague as endemic to Asia and other outposts of the British Empire. It was with the rise of germ theory in the 1880s that the notion of an endemic disease began to subtly change to mean a disease that was always present in a given geographical region, but which could erupt into an epidemic or a pandemic at any time due to a constellation of ecological, environmental, or social factors. So the irony is that this notion of endemicity is today now being deployed by populist politicians in the West to declare that the pandemic is over and to try and distinguish their polities from those of countries such as China, where due to substandard vaccines and high levels of vaccine hesitancy, COVID continues to present a risk of hospitalization and death. And I think it also glosses over the fact that each day, thousands of people in sub-Saharan Africa die of tropical diseases, such as malaria, which, as you pointing out, was once pandemic, right? Malaria was once pandemic. We had malaria in the southern United States. We even had malaria in England on the banks of the Thames and the Essex marshes. So the point is that today, such diseases are no longer considered a problem for the global north because they are no longer pandemic. Another term that I think will repay closer examination is variants of concern. COVID-19 has been described as many as the first pandemic of the post-genomic era. So it's certainly the case that never before has the genome of a new pandemic pathogen been sequenced and published so quickly. And we've also, of course, had this real-time sequencing of the kind of alphabet soup of COVID variants, right? Alpha, Delta, and now Omicron, and what is it, B.111, I lose track, there are so many now. It's been unprecedented, right? But this is not the first time that these genomic technologies have been deployed. They also played a critical role in the WHO's decision to declare a global pandemic alert in June 2009, shortly after the sequencing of the H1N1 virus that emerged unexpectedly in Mexico a few months earlier. This virus, you will recall, was labeled a triple reassortant swine influenza virus. However, when this new virus turned out to be no more severe than a regular seasonal influenza, the WHO's declaration undermined trust in science and fueled conspiracy theories about pharmaceutical profiteering. And here I think is a very clear sort of illustration of this theme. I can't remember where I got it from, but it kind of sums it up quite succinctly. So my point really is that we need much better histories of these genomic technologies and their integration into public health surveillance systems which are designed to warn us of spillovers of viruses from animal reservoirs. And we also need to interrogate how these technologies help produce these biosecurity discourses around emerging infectious diseases and direct scientific funding for scientific research and experimentation, including, of course, controversial gain-of-function experiments. It is at times like these that historians of science and medicine can, I think, perform a useful public service by opening up this black box of taken-for-granted scientific terms and concepts and reconstructing their history. Okay, so very quickly, just to finish off. Until now, I've been speaking mostly of discontinuities, but historians and scientists interested in the history of pandemics also need to be alive to continuities with the past. Those images of coronavirus waiting rooms in Wuhan should have reminded us of the picture of the emergency influenza ward at Camp Funston in 1918. When face masks began appearing on the streets of China, Hong Kong, and Seoul, we should have recalled that the use of face masks to block the transmission of an airborne pathogen dates back to the pneumonic plague outbreak in Manchuria in 1910, and possibly before. I'm sure, David, you've got earlier examples too. And we also, we know that in 1918, several US cities mandated face masks in public spaces, hence the picture I showed you from Seattle of all those police and wearing face masks. Moreover, although the scale of today's lockdowns may have been unprecedented, quarantines are a tried and tested response to outbreaks, one that has changed little since 1377, when the city of Dubrovnik banned travelers from plague-infested areas entering the city walls. Whether they take the form of a biohazard tent or a lazaretto, as in Venice, the Lazaretto of Ancona, which dates from the 17th century, their spatial logic is straightforward and easily understood. Indeed, it could be argued there are very, very few medical practices that cast back and forward in time with such full and easy comprehensibility. The task for medical historians, then, is to cultivate a more profound imaginative engagement with the history of pandemics, one that is not afraid to ask big questions about the limits of scientific expertise and our interactions with pathogens over long durée time frames. To succeed, I believe such an approach demands an active dialogue, really, between the life sciences and the medical and environmental humanities. In particular, it requires medical historians interested in the genesis of pandemics and their preservation in public memory to cultivate exchanges with evolutionary biologists and molecular pathologists. So David's already talked a little bit about plague, but this is a perfect example. So we know that thanks to the analysis of DNA from ancient plague burial grounds, that Yersinia pestis was responsible for both the Black Death of the 14th century and the third plague pandemic that spread from China at the close of the 19th century. And that this discovery, which we owe to modern science, has changed the historiography of how we think of these different pandemics. I'm also thinking of your colleague at the NIAID, Jeffrey Taubenberg, and his work with Anne Reid when in 1999 they announced, to the astonishment of the world, that they'd succeeded in sequencing the entire genome of the H1N1 Spanish flu virus. That event kept memories, or revived memories, if you like, of the 1918 pandemic and prevented it from slipping into oblivion. Most of all, though, I think we need to foster a more capacious pandemic imagination. For it's only by asking questions about how the past develops over centuries and millennia and how people coped during previous times of plague that we can begin to discuss the issue of our survival and flourishing in the present. Even now, hardly a day goes by without some announcement about the basic reproductive rate of the coronavirus. But as useful as this epidemiological measure may be for plotting the rate of increase of the virus, it does not tell us when or how we will be delivered from our pandemic purgatory, much less what we need to do to prevent disaster from recurring and hopefully build a better world for our children. As the WHO's Director General remarked in June of 2020, just 6 months into the pandemic of COVID-19, and I'm quoting, "None of us could have imagined how our world and our lives would be thrown into turmoil by this new virus." I say to you, we cannot allow our imaginations to fail us so catastrophically again. Thank you very much. If I can, I should say very quickly, I began this talk by saying there were no official memorials to the pandemic. For those of you who may not have had a chance to visit London recently, this looks like an official memorial, but it's actually a public memorial, a people's memorial. It has not been authorized. Those signs are faked up wooden signs which were put up overnight. And these hearts have spread all along a stretch of Albert Embankment, the south bank of the Thames, right opposite the House of Parliament. And it's become something of a site of pilgrimage for bereaved families all over the UK. So thank you.